All right. Well, again, welcome to this press conference of the three human rights experts who have presented their reports to the third committee yesterday afternoon. And we have right next to me Mr. Abdelhamid El-Jamri, Chair of the Committee on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and members of their families. Mr. Al-Jamri will be presenting in French and can take questions in French. However, we do have our colleague from our office who can interpret. Then next to him we have Mr. Tomás Ojea Quninta, Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. And on the left side we have Mr. François Crépeau, Special Rapporteur on the human rights of migrants. So without further ado, I'll let the experts take the floor. Mr. Jamri, would you like to go first?
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Donc merci d'être là pour cette conférence de presse. En fait, donc je préside le comité sur les droits des travailleurs migrants. Et ce comité qui a démarré depuis 10 ans maintenant, donc cette année c'est l'année anniversaire après 10 années de travail. Et le comité travaille principalement sur 3 axes. Le premier axe, c'est l'examen des rapports des États parties. Le deuxième axe, c'est la promotion de la convention, parce qu'elle reste quand même une jeune convention et qui a besoin de beaucoup de promotion, donc pour aller vers plus de ratification. Et le troisième axe, c'est l'organisation de la réflexion autour d'un certain nombre de thèmes pour donner certaines interprétations de la Convention et pour mieux expliquer ses dispositions. Et ça prend toujours souvent sous forme de ce qu'on appelle journée de discussion générale. Donc nous en avons organisé un certain nombre. Donc aujourd'hui, la Convention, donc, elle est plus nécessaire que jamais parce que pour plusieurs raisons. Donc, d'abord, il faut regarder l'actualité, ce qui se passe aujourd'hui dans le monde sur la question migratoire, que ce soit par rapport aux travailleurs, ceux qui souhaitent immigrer de façon irrégulière, que ce soit au niveau des droits et dans un certain nombre de pays. Et aussi, donc, ça reste un outil spécifique de défense des droits des travailleurs migrants. C'est le seul outil spécifique qui existe aujourd'hui, donc, sur la question de défense des droits des travailleurs migrants. Et donc, il y a besoin de le renforcer donc, pour aller vers plus de protection des travailleurs migrants. Et c'est aussi, la Convention sert aussi aujourd'hui pour beaucoup d'États, notamment les États parties, comme guide à la construction de leur politique publique en matière de migration. Et ça, c'est très important parce que la Convention est une convention très large qui dispose de beaucoup d'articles et qui donne des indications aux États donc, pour mieux gérer leur migration. Et c'est aussi un outil de développement. Un outil de développement parce que un migrant qui jouit de ses droits, c'est un migrant qui est profitable pour le pays d'origine, pour le pays d'accueil et pour le pays de transit. Donc, les États ont intérêt aussi à donner des droits donc, pour pouvoir tirer le maximum de la présence des travailleurs migrants sur leur sol. Aujourd'hui, donc, on estime le nombre de migrants internationaux à 240 millions. Et ce qui est nouveau un peu par rapport au flux migratoire, c'est que la migration sud-sud devient aussi importante que la migration sud-nord. Et ça, c'est un nouvel élément en fait dans l'évolution de la migration. Et aussi, donc, on voit d'une façon très croissante la migration nord-sud qui commence à se développer aussi avec un taux de croissance assez important. Pendant les années 80, quand la communauté internationale a commencé à travailler sur la convention qui a été adoptée en 1990 par la suite, la communauté internationale avait pris conscience de la gravité de la situation par rapport à l'augmentation des flux migratoires et aussi par rapport à l'augmentation de la traite de l'être humain. Donc c'est ce qui a fait donc, que la communauté internationale a adopté cette convention-là et donc qui exprime une certaine conscience de la situation grave que vivent les migrants. Aujourd'hui, je pense qu'on peut se trouver dans la même situation. On a une augmentation importante des flux migratoires et on a aussi une augmentation importante de la traite de l'être humain. Donc aujourd'hui, ce que nous demandons aux États, c'est cette conscience dont ils ont fait preuve pendant les années 80 pour aboutir à l'adoption de la Convention 90. Cette conscience se transforme aujourd'hui en action concrète pour aller vers plus de protection des travailleurs migrants. Donc je suis à votre disposition. Merci.
Does anyone need to Okay. So what she said basically is that the Migrant Convention is now celebrating its 10th anniversary, and in the committee it's used to undertake 3 types of activities: consideration of state parties' report, the promotion of the convention in terms of ratification, and also general discussions in terms of interpretation of the provisions of the convention. He highlighted also that this convention still remains a good instrument when we look at the recent events in terms of how migration is putting some people at danger, especially those coming from Africa to Europe. That justifies the need to move forward in terms of the promotion and ratification of the convention. And it remains also a good guidance for state parties to help them shape the migration policies. He highlighted also that the convention is an important instrument because when migrants enjoy their rights, their situation is profitable to both countries of origin and transit and also a destination. There are today 240 million migrants around the world. It's not only anymore about south-north migration, but south-south migration and also north-south migration is increasing. And lastly, he highlighted that the increasing move in migration, which was accompanied by also trafficking in persons, justified the work in the earlier 80s before the convention is adopted in the earlier 90s. So this type of problems still remains today, and which justifies the need to promote the convention and for more ratification.
We would now invite Mr. Crepeau, and we will take questions at the end, I guess, because it would be, we want to ensure that everybody gets their say first.
Good. Good morning, everyone. My report bore on the issue of global migration governance. My aim was to provide an overarching summary of what I believe to be the key architecture of global migration governance in the world, and provide constructive suggestions on how to better protect human rights in the sphere of international governance processes. The first point I want to emphasize is that due to the lack of a comprehensive framework, global migration governance remains fragmented, with different institutional approaches, normative frameworks relating to specific aspects of migration, such as the human rights of migrants, or the smuggling of migrants, or human trafficking, or refugees and asylum seekers, or labor migration. All this in different pieces, all detached from one another. There's not one migration organization within the United Nations, although many agencies do have as part of their job to take care of some migrants relating to their mandate. And there's no coherent institutional framework governing migration. There's no global lead agency with a comprehensive mandate on migration that would include the legal protection of migrants, despite the good work of IOM, which is the International Organization for Migration, which is outside the UN, and doesn't have a constitution that has the word human rights in it. It does good work, but it's not the focus of its mandate. States continue attempting to govern migration largely on a unilateral or bilateral basis. This has led to lack of coherence between the global, the regional, the national governance. And I also observe in the report a retreat from binding United Nations-based normative frameworks, such as the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, which is not well ratified yet, and with a state preference for informal processes, state-led, informal, non-binding, etc. The lack of transparency, the lack of accountability of these processes may have, and often has, a negative impact on the human rights of migrants. And I underline the need for better global migration governance in a strengthened institutional framework based inside the UN. The UN should have a strong voice on migration, which is a fundamental human phenomenon that has always existed and that will always exist. And the UN should have a strong voice and doesn't have it at present. Migrants should always be seen first as human beings with human rights before being considered as agents for development or in other ways. And I made some proposals for a revised institutional framework for migration within the UN, for example, including IOM, the International Organization for Migration, inside the United Nations with a revised constitution in order to allow it to expand the human rights work it does already in great part. The second point I want to emphasize is the fact that repressive border policies alone are totally ineffective at stopping irregular migration. Repressive border policies, interception at sea, we've seen the disaster in Lampedusa, are in fact empowering and entrenching smuggling rings, and they are increasing their hold on vulnerable migrants, thus reducing the capacity of states to control their borders. And it's quite paradoxical that the policies put in place to implement territorial sovereignty, in fact, lead to less control over territorial sovereignty. Migrants migrate irregularly due to a lack of regular migration channels and largely in response to unrecognized labor needs in destination states. States should recognize such labor needs, including for low-skilled work in construction, in agriculture, in hospitality, in caregiving, for which there's not enough done in terms of migration channels, of legal migration channels. They should also sanction unscrupulous employers who exploit irregular migrants. At present, there is an underground labor market controlled by employers who exploit migrants. Migrants know that they will find a job because there are so many jobs in this underground labor market that citizens won't take in these conditions and that irregular migrants will take. And employers know that. And these employers are citizens, locals. And there's quite little done in most countries to sanction these employers and reduce the attractiveness of this underground labor market. And this would lead to less irregular border crossings, less smuggling of migrants, less loss of life at borders, and less migrants' rights violations. States would still have the sovereignty to decide on the number of migrants they wish to admit, and that has to be realistic based on needs. Global migration governance should thus be seen as reclaiming sovereignty, not ceding it. The last little point I'd like to mention is a few words about the high-level dialogue on international migration and development that happened 3 weeks ago here in New York. I want to emphasize that I'm pleased with the declaration that was adopted on the 4th of October and with the discussions that happened at the high-level dialogue. Human rights were part of the discussions from beginning to end, and were not limited to the roundtable on the human rights of migrants. And to me, that's a very good thing. States, at least in the UN fora, like this one, like the high-level dialogue, which it contrasts a bit with other forums, states now talk the talk of migrants' rights. And we have to see whether they'll walk the walk as well. Thank you.
Now we would invite also Mr. Ojea Quintana to present on a different subject, and then you can ask questions of all three afterwards.
Thank you. Well, yesterday I presented my report to the third committee, and I would say that the important message is for the international community is to remain engaged on the human rights situation in Myanmar in the context of this new transition. I believe that to be a friend of Myanmar, now we see many states engaging bilaterally with Myanmar, and I believe that to be a friend of Myanmar and a supporter of the reform process taking place there involves raising human rights issues of concern and working with the government to find solutions. There are real dangers in closing over shortcomings in the area of human rights or presuming that these shortcomings will inevitably be addressed through the momentum of current reforms. Now, Myanmar has made some important steps toward democratic reform and national reconciliation, and this includes the release of a large number of political prisoners, more than 1,000, a greater media freedom, an active parliament. Now the prospect of a national ceasefire agreement, maybe next November. These are all developments that we need to support and encourage. We need to really support and highlight the significance of the 13 ceasefire agreements already with ethnic minority groups, and as I say, the prospect of a national ceasefire agreement very soon. Now, the fighting, some fighting continues in Kachin and northern Shan state, and this remind us the suffering, the conflict, the conflicts in the suffering that of the people in ethnic border areas. These people in border areas have suffered the consequences of internal conflict for decades. And that's why a very important message is that the military, in the context of these ceasefire agreements, needs to be fully on board with these agreements endorsed by a civilian government. And once agreed, the military needs to begin a demilitarization of these ethnic border areas. I welcome, of course, as I say, the release of political prisoners. Over 950 prisoners were released in May 2011. However, I am concerned about what we now call the new arrests. This is those people being arrested in relation to peaceful demonstrations and in relations to those involving land right issues. The problem of land confiscation or land appropriation, it's becoming increasingly serious in Myanmar, and I would like to see that the government takes the proper measures towards addressing this issue. Now, the human rights situation in Rakhine State is still very serious. Now, the government is showing a greater willingness to address it, and this includes a recent visit of the president of the country to that state, the disbandment of the former border security force named Nasaka. In the recent violence, the government identified some people who might be involved in the violence in Tandue in Rakhine State, and they arrested them, and these are Rakhine Buddhists, and some of them belong to the Rakhine Nationalist Development Party. This is showing how the government is trying to fairly and address the issue in a balanced approach. Now, there is still an underlying pattern of discrimination against the Muslim community, and particularly the Rohingya. This endemic discrimination is currently being reflected in a policy of segregation of the Muslim and Rohingya community in Rakhine State, which is becoming increasingly permanent. And this is bringing harsh and discriminatory restrictions on freedom of movement remaining in place. The issue of equal access to citizenship of the Rohingya community also remain central in finding solutions. And what is more and more important is that the government has yet to fulfill its obligation under international human rights law to investigate the allegations of widespread human rights violations, including by the security forces reportedly committed during the initial June 2012 violence, and to hold the perpetrators to account. The government cannot renege on these obligations. The situation in Rakhine State is fueling a wider occurrence of communal and religious violence, which is posing one of the most serious threats to the reform process. Now, there are leaders within the community in Myanmar, including Buddhist monks, who are playing a positive role in addressing the discrimination and violence against Muslim populations. These voices need to be heard and supported. We have heard some other voices lately, some other monks really having an important role in incitement religious and communal hatred. We need to hear some other voices. There are many other voices in the country. We need to support these voices. I met some of these leaders during my latest missions to Myanmar, included a Buddhist monk in Lasho. And this Buddhist monk in Lasho, after the violence, he gave shelter to more than 1,000 Muslims running out from the violence, and he gave shelter to these 1,000 Muslims in his monastery. All right, so let me say something important. I do not believe that this violence that we are seeing now what I say is that I do not believe that the newfound freedoms in Myanmar are to blame for the violence and incitement that the country has recently seen. I have visited Myanmar 8 times, and I have seen that the people in Myanmar are kind and peaceful people. This violence should be seen more as a continuation of the way organized groups with political and social agendas have operated under decades of military rule, through violence and incitement against minority groups. A more open society in which human rights are respected and in which all individuals and groups are accountable under the rule of law will soon mean that this way of operating will be a thing of the past. I recognize the commendable speeches made by the President to counter the spread of discriminatory views on the basis of ethnic and religion, but urge more to be done. For instance, as Myanmar proceeds with the democratic transition to a civilian form of governance, the police force needs to become the prime force maintaining law and order, with the military moving back to the barracks. This is an important element of the rule of law. It will involve capacity building and clear instructions from the authorities to ensure that the police fulfill their duty in protecting community from violence, and accountability if they fail to perform their duty. The problem of accountability: Myanmar has been under rule of law for decades, under military regime for decades. There is no practice, there is no concept of what accountability means, what the rule of law means, and now this transition, this civilian transition, is facing the challenge to how security forces, for example, deal with the issue of accountability. Last point, and I will finish. In my report, I have urged reform of the Constitution to maintain the momentum of the transition to democracy and national reconciliation. This includes the amendment of provisions which allow for the military appointees to occupy 25% of seats in parliament, and also which disqualify persons from being president on unfair grounds, and the inclusion of provisions to address the aspirations of ethnic minority groups. After the ceasefire agreements, the next discussion in Myanmar will be how to include the aspirations of ethnic minority groups in the political and institutional and legal framework, and this will imply discussions in respect to amending the Constitution. So this was my last report to the third committee. I will end my mandate next March. I have to thank the government of Myanmar. Has been very cooperative with my mandate. I visited, as I say, the country 8 times. The government always engaged with me and in productive way, and I think we need to recognize this. I also have to thank the third committee and the United Nations for giving me this very important responsibility to bring the voices of the people to these important forums. And finally, I have to thank the people of Myanmar who always engaging with me in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News, and on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, we thank you for the panel and for all of the briefings on these different topics. My question is first to Mr. Quintana on Myanmar, Burma, and that is on these ethnic divide, or the Muslim Buddhist divide in Rakhine province. Aung San Suu Kyi was just speaking about it and said that she did not see it as ethnic cleansing, but did see it as a climate of fear. You say it's not about the democratic, the newly found democratic position in the country. Do you see it as ethnic cleansing? And to what then do you attribute it? Who's to blame, really, on that? And just a separate question on the migration experts. Mexico played a very high role on the high level on migration, and pointed out the extortion and violence that can be part of the illegal process between Mexico and the United States, the illegal transit. Is there anything you see as coming out of this that would help that situation? Thank you.
Yeah, I visited Rakhine State, where the Rohingya community lives, 3 times. In my past reports, even before the violence started, my judgment about the situation is that there is an existence of a pattern of discrimination against this Rohingya community. What means a pattern of discrimination means that all aspects of the livelihood of the Rohingya community are affected by discrimination. We are talking about health, well, there are shortcomings in respect to the access to health. We are talking about education, there is shortcomings in respect to education, and so on and so forth. So how I address the situation is a serious pattern of discrimination against the Rohingya community. And the responsibility here is on the government. Again, as I said, I think the central government is realizing that more has to be done in respect to the situation in Rakhine. I see a problem at the state level authorities and at the township level authorities as well. I think that the state authorities in Rakhine State are really not on board with the central government in respect to the necessity to address the problems in Rakhine State. I think that I won't talk about others, but I think that Madame Aung San Suu Kyi, what was important once this transition started, is that she decided to become part of the transition. And now she's a member of the parliament. She could have taken some other decision and be apart from this. So she's living in Myanmar. To live in Myanmar, and I have to be frank with you, to live in Myanmar and to discuss the issue of religious tolerance, particularly with respect to Muslims, it is very difficult. It is very difficult. I have faced situations where I discuss human rights with people in a very productive way, but once the issue of religious tolerance comes to the discussion, the conversation changes completely. So the situation is quite complicated in the country in respect to this problem about religious and communal misunderstanding or violence. And one more element is, what is the role of the media? And here I'm talking about the local media, not specifically about international, but the local media is playing a very inconvenient role in this respect, inciting a lot. So when the government is willing to take proper measures to address the religious and communal violence, you can have the other day a front page of a newspaper, and then all your efforts suddenly are gone, because these newspapers are the kind of elements that the most remote villages have access to. They only receive these kind of newspapers. So you have, villagers really being incited by this local media. And this is something that had to be said, and I'm calling the media to play a responsible and ethical role in this respect.
Can I follow up, please?
I think we would take the other
Yes.
first.
Merci. Donc, pour la question concernant le Mexique, effectivement, notre comité a eu l'occasion d'examiner plusieurs rapports d'États d'Amérique centrale et d'Amérique du Sud. Et donc, nous avons eu des informations très précises sur ce qui se passe en fait pendant la traversée. Donc, c'est vrai, c'est pas seulement au Mexique, mais aussi dans d'autres parties du monde. La même situation se trouve. Et on sait que le Mexique, au niveau fédéral, fait des efforts très importants donc, pour protéger les migrants. Mais ce n'est pas suffisant. Ce n'est pas suffisant parce que déjà le pays manque de moyens, et aussi parce que la question migratoire aujourd'hui, il faut la voir d'un point de vue régional, pas seulement au niveau d'un seul État. Il faut lui donner cette dimension régionale. Et je pense que les premiers responsables des exactions qui se trouvent aujourd'hui, qui concernent les migrants qui essaient d'entrer aux États-Unis ou qui essaient d'entrer en Europe, les pays qui se transforment en citadelles sont responsables aussi. Ils ont une grande part de la responsabilité. Les États-Unis en bloquant ses frontières, et là, cette responsabilité, donc, que les migrants subissent des exactions. La même chose pour l'Europe, avec ce qui se passe entre l'Europe et l'Afrique, notamment au niveau de la Méditerranée. Donc, il y a une responsabilité, même si les pays ne sont pas concernés directement. En fait, ils sont concernés par cette question-là, ils sont concernés des exactions. Et moi, actuellement, je suis en poste à Nouakchott, en Mauritanie, parce que je dirige une mission de l'Union européenne sur les questions migratoires, justement. Et ce qu'on voit, c'est que la migration se fera de toute façon. De toute façon, il se fera. Donc, on voit bien, au niveau de la carte, par exemple, si on prend l'Afrique du Nord, que je connais bien, quand on ferme les frontières au niveau du Maghreb, on essaie de sortir par le Sénégal ou par la Mauritanie. Quand on ferme les frontières en Mauritanie, on essaie de sortir par la Libye. Et à chaque fois, on le voit. À chaque fois. Et dernièrement, on a bien fermé les frontières maritimes au niveau de la Mauritanie. Mais ce qui se passe, c'est que tout de suite, les migrants, ils sont intelligents. Les candidats à l'immigration sont intelligents. Donc, ils voient qu'il y a une faille au niveau de Melilla, par exemple. Eh bien, ils vont essayer de partir par Melilla. C'est ça. Et aujourd'hui, la question qui se pose aussi par rapport à la question sur le Mexique, c'est la question des droits de l'homme aux frontières, qui est un élément très important. C'est vrai qu'au niveau de la loi internationale, tout ce qui est politique migratoire en ce qui concerne l'entrée, le séjour et la sortie relève de chaque État. Ça veut dire qu'il n'y a pas d'instrument international qui donne des indications par rapport à ça, donc il y a des obligations. Et donc, ce qui fait que chaque pays a la souveraineté de mettre en place sa politique migratoire, donc en ce qui concerne l'entrée, le séjour et la sortie. Mais ce qu'on demande aujourd'hui aux États, déjà on demande à la communauté internationale de réfléchir sur cette question de droit aux frontières. Et quand je dis droit aux frontières, ce n'est pas seulement les frontières physiques. Les frontières, ça commence le jour où le candidat à la migration va demander son visa dans un consulat. Parce que les difficultés commencent là aussi. Et des fois, il faut faire plusieurs kilomètres pour pouvoir le faire. Donc, c'est très... Et donc, c'est pour ça qu'il faut une dose d'humanité dans le traitement actuellement des migrants qui se présentent aux différentes frontières, en attendant que la communauté internationale ait quelque chose, des propositions, des résolutions sur cette question-là. Et je pense que le débat a commencé au niveau des Nations Unies depuis 1 an maintenant, 1 an et demi, sur cette question-là de droits de l'homme aux frontières. Merci.
Summary or interpretation of that, or?
No, can we go follow up, please? We don't have very much time.
Okay. Yeah.
Pour Monsieur Jamri, Bouchabé Youssef de l'agence Maghreb Presse. Hier, devant la 3e commission, vous lanciez un appel pour la ratification de la Convention. Il y a seulement 47 pays sur les 193 États. Comment expliquez-vous cette situation? Est-ce que c'est dû, comme a dit M. Crépeau, à l'absence d'une stratégie au niveau international, hein? Deuxièmement, vous parliez juste à l'instant de la dimension régionale. Est-ce que vous pensez que des initiatives comme celle que le Maroc, pour lequel a appelé ici même, dans un side event pour une stratégie africaine en matière de migration, peut contribuer à résoudre en partie ce problème? Je vous remercie.
Merci pour votre question. En fait, l'appel à la ratification, donc c'est un appel qu'on fait pratiquement tous les jours maintenant, parce que en fait, au niveau de la Convention, l'un des travaux qu'a fait le comité depuis son installation, c'est la promotion de la Convention. Et la promotion s'est faite en relation avec un comité directeur qui était chargé déjà de la promotion avant son entrée en vigueur à Genève, et aussi avec la société civile. Et au niveau de la société civile, nous avons une plateforme d'ONG internationale qui s'est constituée, qui est basée à Genève et qui accompagne le comité dans son travail. Et depuis, il y a des campagnes de ratification un peu partout dans le monde, notamment dans les pays du Nord. Et des études ont été faites, et toutes les études ont porté sur les obstacles à la ratification. Et le résultat, c'est qu'au niveau de la ratification, il n'y a aucun obstacle juridique, il n'y a aucun obstacle économique. Mais l'obstacle principal reste politique. Et ça, c'est très important. Donc les pays qui n'ont pas encore ratifié aujourd'hui ou qui ne veulent pas ratifier, parce qu'aujourd'hui, avant on disait qu'il y avait deux types d'États, soit des États qui ont ratifié, soit des États qui n'ont pas ratifié. Aujourd'hui, on est devant trois types d'États. Des États qui ont ratifié, des États qui n'ont pas ratifié, et des États qui ne veulent pas ratifier, qui le disent clairement. Donc ça, et à chaque fois, leur justification, c'est la question des travailleurs migrants en situation irrégulière. Donc ils pensent que la Convention donne des droits extraordinaires aux travailleurs migrants en situation irrégulière, alors que la réalité est autre. Donc les travailleurs en situation irrégulière dans la Convention, ce sont des droits de base que chaque État doit donner à sa population et aux migrants. Par exemple, si je prends la question de la santé, de toute façon, l'existence de migrants en situation irrégulière est une réalité. On les estime à un nombre important actuellement, est une réalité au niveau de chaque État. Et si on prive une fraction de la population des soins, on ne peut pas imaginer un pays qui ne donne pas les soins, par exemple, aux personnes âgées, aux enfants. Si on prive une partie de la population, parce que c'est une population, même mis à part sa situation administrative, c'est une population qui vit dans le pays, qui fait partie du peuple. Donc si on ne la soigne pas, ça va devenir un problème de santé publique. La même chose, si on ne l'éduque pas, on va produire des citoyens qui ne sont pas formés, qui ne vont pas jouer un rôle important dans le développement du pays. Donc aujourd'hui, il faut vraiment que les États aille vers la ratification, parce que la Convention, c'est une convention d'avenir. C'est une convention d'avenir parce qu'elle a les éléments. C'est un outil extraordinaire au niveau de l'élaboration des politiques publiques, donc en matière de migration. Et de toute façon, toutes les conventions concernant la migration ne sont pas beaucoup ratifiées. Si on prend aussi les deux conventions de BIT, elles ne sont pas ratifiées de façon très forte. Donc certaines ont moins d'États parties que la Convention sur les droits des migrants. Et si on prend les trois conventions, les deux conventions du BIT et la Convention de 90, elles sont toutes ratifiées. Il y a 88 États qui ont ratifié au moins une de ces conventions-là. Donc globalement, ça reste faible par rapport aux 193 États. Donc c'est une question politique. Je prends par exemple le cas de l'Europe. La question migratoire l'Europe a une position duale au niveau de la migration. Nous avons le politique qui dit zéro migration, parce que ça rapporte des voix, parce que ça permet de faire de la politique et tout ça. Et nous avons l'économique qui fait appel à la migration, qui souhaite qu'il y ait de plus en plus de migrants pour fluidifier la main-d'œuvre, pour fluidifier le travail. Et c'est vrai que moi j'insiste toujours sur la dimension régionale des politiques migratoires, et ce qu'a fait le Maroc dernièrement, c'est formidable. Tout le monde a applaudi les propositions. Donc ça veut dire prendre un peu, regarder enfin la réalité de la question migratoire au Maroc par rapport aux migrants subsahariens notamment, qui ne sont pas très nombreux après tout, qui ne sont que 12 000, estimés à 12 000. 12 000 pour une population de 36 millions. Donc je veux dire, le Maroc peut les absorber facilement. En plus, s'ils sont au Maroc, c'est parce qu'il y a du travail aussi. Il faut dire la réalité aussi. Donc, c'est qu'il y a une réalité le Maroc a besoin aussi de cette main-d'œuvre étrangère, donc, pour pouvoir développer son économie. Donc, la proposition du Maroc, elle a été applaudie à tous les niveaux, et c'est une bonne initiative. J'espère que d'autres pays africains aussi vont faire de même. idem, aujourd'hui, donc, depuis cette initiative marocaine, il y a d'autres initiatives. Il y a l'Union africaine, par exemple, qui a demandé à ce que soit discutée la question migratoire lors du prochain sommet euro-africain, en avril 2014. Il y a le président du Mali, du Sénégal, qui a fait une déclaration très importante suite à ce qui s'est passé au sud de l'Italie. Donc ça, il y a, je dirais, un sursaut par rapport à cette question-là, et je pense que ça va continuer. Je vous remercie.
Thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Intercity Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks for the three of you for coming. Personally, I think it should have been two separate press conferences, and I'm not sure that anyone should automatically get the first question. That said, I wanted to ask Mr. Ojea Quintana about in Rakhine State. I wanted to know, there's this, yesterday in the third committee, there seemed to be some dispute about whether there is a two-child policy in place. So I wanted to know, since you've been there, is there such a policy? And also, Mr. Nambiar was met with by something called the Kachin Baptist Convention about villagers trapped in Putao district. There's 53 people, they claim, trapped by the army, their land given to a tycoon called Tai Za. And I wonder, this may be too small for you, but are you aware of this type of issue in which the government military power is used to favor long-time, businessmen such as that? And what's your role in this type of a situation? Thank you.
When asked the central government was about the two-child policy, the response was, there's no two-child policy. There's no two-child policy. They recognize that might have been in the past practice of two-child policy. And for me, it was not clear whether this practice of two-child policy remained. So that's the way I will answer to you. There's the information, specific information, first-hand information collected from the government in Naypyidaw. So, of course, I really advocated against this two-child policy with the Minister of Immigration, particularly, in Naypyidaw, and with the state authorities in Sittwe as well. In respect to land appropriation issues, I just said it is increasingly becoming an issue during this transition, particularly because, first, there is no a rule of law framework at all. You don't have any place to go when you want to claim about land rights. There is no even judicial remedies for that at all. So in those areas where independent or independent observers or some other people who are really independent can access non-controlled state areas, even some areas in Kachin State, it's very difficult to really respect this kind of, these are basic human rights, the people who have been living in their land for generations, and suddenly the excuse now is that according to the Constitution, the land belongs to the state. So then you are not the owner, and then we can take your land. This is the kind of responses that I receive in Naypyidaw, which might have some point, but that doesn't mean that still these people have rights over their land that have been working in.
Thank you, Mr. Quintina. I just wanted to ask you kindly, if you can, a little bit more elaborate when you mentioned that segregation is becoming a permanent trend. And number two, just as a follow-up of my colleague Pamela before, when you try to respond to her whether you agree with the statement of the Nobel Prize winner that there is no ethnic cleansing going on in Myanmar against the Myanmar's Muslim, you said it's very difficult to discuss the religious issues in Myanmar. What does it mean? And at the end, just since there is a conflicting report, how many Muslims are really in Myanmar?
The first question you said?
The first question, permanent segregation.
Yeah, that's new element. I mean, there has been a pattern of discrimination against the Rohingya, but they were not segregated. They were living together in Rakhine State with some other, with Buddhist Rakhine. But the segregation now is becoming a permanent policy. What I mean is, after the violence, the Rohingyas have been put in IDP camps.
Excuse me?
In IDP camps.
IDP
IDP, internal displaced camps, people camps, and the government is building shelters there. These shelters are I think we need support this initiative for the government to really grant the proper livelihood of these communities in these camps. But the reality is this is becoming permanent, and these communities are not being allowed to go back to their land in Rakhine State.
How many people, Muslims, we are talking about?
Well, the number of the Rohingyas living in Rakhine State are about 800,000 people, almost 1 million, yeah. And let me tell you, I read the news about the statement of Madame Aung San Suu Kyi, and again, I will not talk about the statements of some other people. I always try to talk about the government, the role of the government in respect to human rights, because that's my job. And I talked to her many times, and I don't agree that she said that there is not ethnic cleansing in Myanmar. She just said, and I think, that there is a very serious issue in respect to fear of the violence, because there is an important issue. It's not the Buddhist communities, the ordinary people, the villagers, are people that are also afraid about the violence. As I said, I do not believe that these are violent people. These are I met them many times. These are peaceful communities, and suddenly driven from some, incitements from outside their communities, and they found themselves in the middle of the violence, and the violence, serious violence. We are talking about very serious violence. So again, the way that I address the issue is through the human rights perspective, as a pattern of serious discrimination, which affects all aspects of the livelihood of the Rohingya community, and that's serious enough for the government to address, and for the international community also to work with them. Now the government is engaging. The government of Myanmar is engaging with OIC. And OIC might go to the country and visit Rakhine State.
Organization for Islamic Conference.
Exactly, which is a good news, because we always need to try engagement, and this is important. And we need to follow these developments closely to see the results. I think it is positive. Also here in New York at the third committee, there was a discussion whether or not it was going to be a resolution on Myanmar, with the OIC pursuing their own resolution, and some other states that didn't want to really go forward with a resolution. Now it seems that's going to be a resolution by consent, and with the consent of the government of Myanmar. And this is good. This is good. We need to try engagement. The situation is, the violence has been serious, and one way to start solving the violence is through engagement. And let me say one more thing with respect to Rakhine State. I visited Butidong prison, which is a township in Rakhine State, which suffer a lot of violence. And in Butidong, I met 4 UN workers who were detained, and they were released. But now there are still 4 INGOs, international non-governmental workers, who remain behind bars in Butidong prison. I urge the government to release them. These are workers who have committed for the good of the people for years, and I think they are being held under arbitrary grounds.
Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press, and this question is for Mr. Crépeau. I understand, of course, your focus is on the human rights of migrants, and that is also the focus of the convention, of course. But the flip side of rights are responsibilities, and I'm wondering, whether you would have anything to say, or whether something should be included in your report about the responsibilities of migrants to adhere to the laws of the host country, to try to assimilate as best they can, keeping their own culture, traditions, but also assimilate into the culture of the host country, including such issues as language, because that's part of the tension. You know, that migrants will come to a host country but want to live as if they were back in their originating country, and not assimilate. Thank you.
Maybe a few words on the previous questions that were asked on migration, because I
really would like, because I think we're almost out of time, and I really would appreciate if you would address my question first, okay?
So I'll address your question first. I agree with you that human rights have included in them responsibilities, which is responsibilities to protect the human rights. That's the responsibility, and that's the responsibility for everyone. The human rights of everyone have to be protected, and they have to be protected by everyone. That includes the government, but that includes also private entities and every one of us in this room. So migrants arrive in a country, they have to respect the laws. There's no problem with that. If they do something illegal, they will be arrested. If they do a criminal act, they will be arrested, detained. They will be tried, and all these rules apply to all migrants everywhere. As long as they don't do anything illegal, there's no reason to think that whatever they do, in whatever manner they do it, is forbidden. And that's often the big issue about assimilation. People see that wearing a veil is an offense to the traditions of the country. Well, wearing a veil is nothing different than wearing a blue mohawk, which offends the sights of many people. It's a choice, a personal choice that is made, and that everyone has to respect. What is important is that there be no violence in the choices. And there is violence. There is violence against women in migrant communities, like there is violence against women in host communities. There's lots of violence in many host communities in the global north, and we have tools to deal with that. We have shelters, we have children aid societies, and these tools should be available to everyone, be they migrants or be they migrants from other generations or descendants of migrants. There's no difference. There shouldn't be a difference in that sense. Equality, equal treatment is to me the key element there. And we have to respect equal treatment for everyone, including migrants. If people are allowed to wear blue mohawks or to have, you know, different habits, to become Carmelites, I mean, why not keep your veil? Why not live differently? These issues are important. They have to be discussed. They have to be understood. And they have to be debated serenely in each and every country. And myths have to be debunked. And that's the responsibility of the government, but it's also the responsibility of religious communities. It's also the responsibility of the media. It's the responsibility of everyone. I think the big issue here is to recognize that migrants have the same human rights and responsibilities as everyone else, except two. When I say migrants, I mean migrants who have not become citizens. The right to vote and be elected, and the right to enter and stay in the country. All other human rights are for everyone, including the right to equality, which applies to everyone without distinction according to national origin. This doesn't mean that you have the right to all the government services that everyone has the right to. I don't have the right to maternity leave. I don't have the right to all sorts of services. I don't have the right to a pension yet. So we're all different. We don't have all the same entitlement to government services, but we have the same human rights. All the same human rights. And migrants are no different in that sense. As long as they're on the territory or under the power of the government, they have the same human rights as anyone else. The same human rights of not being detained arbitrarily, the same human right of not being arrested arbitrarily, the same human right of of being treated equally in the way, in the respect of the way they want to dress or they want to behave, etc., etc. So this is, to me, the framework that should be applied. And to me, that answers a lot of questions. And tribunals and courts have been quite good in many countries at having that framework respected because they don't have the electoral pressure of political leaders. I'd like to say, is that an answer to your question? Good. I'd like to say a few words about the other questions. The question was, will the high-level dialogue, etc., result in less violence at the border? That was the first question. We have to understand that irregular migration happens when you have push factors, pull factors, and a barrier in between. If you work only on the barrier and you still have the push factors and the pull factors, you haven't solved the issue. What you create is a prohibition-type problem, i.e. everything goes underground, and you lose control about the whole exercise, and you empower mafias. That's what happens. If you want to reduce irregular migration, we'll probably never eradicate it, but reduce it, you have to work on the push factors, i.e. violence and poverty in the countries of origin. That's development policies for the past 60 years, which have done some good, failed miserably in many cases. And you have to work on the pull factors. Migrants go to countries where there are jobs for them, and they know it. There are countries where you don't go because there's no job for anyone. Not for the citizens and not for the migrants. But they come to North America, they come to Europe, they come to booming countries in Africa and Asia because there are jobs for them. If you don't work on those underground labor markets, the pull factor will remain. And it's still not acknowledged. We have to acknowledge that. If we, and I'm a bit struck by the EU answer to the Lampedusa disaster, because the first thing that Mr. Barroso announced the day after or 2 days after the disaster was that they would increase the budget of Frontex and implement quickly Eurosur, which are techniques to intercept people at the border in the Mediterranean. Now, I have nothing against having more and better trained border guards who would be human rights sensitive, gender sensitive, who would understand what's going on. I'm all for it. It's violence at the hands of the authorities has gone on for too long in too many countries, and we have to work on training properly these people. Very good. The problem is that if you work only on the barrier, again, you're not touching the pull factors, you're not touching the push factors. And the only thing you do is that you create more incentive for creative mafias to do more evasion tactics. And you're entrenching these mafias. You're empowering them to violate more human rights of migrants. And you lose control of the border. There was no death in the Mediterranean in the 50s and 60s when millions of Africans, North Africans in particular, and Turkish citizens, came to Germany, to France, to Belgium, to Switzerland to occupy jobs. Why? Because there was no barrier. People came because there were jobs. That was acknowledged. It was not underground. It worked. Now, we don't want to acknowledge it, and that's my last point. Why don't we want to acknowledge that? We don't want to acknowledge that because migration has become a toxic debate. Why isn't the International Convention on Migrant Workers well ratified? Because the Global North doesn't want to ratify it, because they don't want to do the speech act of telling their populations, I'm protecting the rights of migrants, including the rights of irregular migrants. Why? Because if they do that, far right, extreme right, or simply, and you even have left-wing parties nowadays, will pounce on them, and they will lose points in the polls. And you see that everywhere. There is now, in many countries, a global consensus, right to left, to not talk about irregular migration in a realistic way, to talk about repression only and not talk about anything else. And that is a problem. And it's a problem that comes from the fact that migrants don't vote, migrants don't protest mostly, they duck and they move on. Why do they do that? Because they fear being arrested, detained, deported. And this is the first time that we have a group in society that cannot fight for their rights from the standpoint of citizenship. Women fought for votes, for the right to vote, and then fought as citizens. Aboriginals fought for the right to vote and then fought for their rights from the standpoint of citizens. Migrants won't be able to do this. They don't count in the political game, and that's a structural defect of democracies. There's no politician, however good the moral compass of the politician can have, there's no politician that has an incentive of protecting the migrants' rights. Their strategic advisor will tell them, if you think we should protect the rights of migrants, just don't say it. Otherwise, we're doomed in the next election. And so we're having here a problem with the capacity of our democracies and other types of political systems to adequately talk about migration publicly and to have a conversation about migration. This is not happening. This is why access to justice, access to courts is so important for migrants, because courts don't have that electoral pressure on their shoulders. And we've seen many courts, European Court of Human Rights, European Court of Justice, US Supreme Court, Canadian Supreme Court, Australian Supreme Court, UK Supreme Court, coming to the rescue of migrants and telling governments, no, you don't have the right to do this. You wouldn't do it for citizens. Why would you do it for foreigners? You don't have you can't detain 7 years without charges or 12 years without charges. Why should you do it for foreigners? Things like that. This has happened here in many places. Access to justice, to courts, tribunals, national human rights institutions, ombudspersons, etc., is key to protecting the rights of migrants and make them rights holders like anyone else. Thank you.
We'll have to leave it at that. We are already late because the noon briefing is supposed to start. So we have 2 more press conferences, and you have the details today, and you have the details in the media advisory there. Thank you for coming.